Hello and welcome from the Australian-Vietnam War Memorial in Canberra, where behind me veterans, their families and members of the public are gathering to mark Vietnam Veterans Day, as they do on this day every year, but also significantly it is the 50th anniversary of the bloody Battle of Long Tan. It was a significant battle, in fact the bloodiest battle involving Australian troops in that 10-decade-long conflict for Australia. On this day 50 years ago, a group of Australians and New Zealanders, vastly outnumbered, facing odds of 20 to 1, fought and won a pitched battle against combined forces of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese in a rubber plantation near the abandoned town of Long Tan. 18 Australians died in that conflict, 24 were wounded. On the Vietnamese side, at least 245 Vietnamese soldiers were killed. It is a day that has gone down in national history, and it'll be marked at a national service about to get underway here behind me in half an hour's time. Joining me now is the Chief Military Historian at the Australian War Memorial, Ashley Eakins, to shed some light on why this day is so significant. Ashley, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Michael.
For those Australians not fully aware of what actually happened on this day in that rubber plantation 50 years ago, take us through the battle.
Well, excuse me, this all began in the early hours of the 17th of August, when the enemy mortared and sent rockets from recoilless rifles into the base area. This caused some consternation, a bombardment lasting about 40 minutes, in the course of which 24 men were wounded, a lot of damage done to the base, and the suspicion amongst a lot of people aroused was that this was the prelude to a major attack on the task force base. That didn't eventuate, but the next morning patrols were sent out to try and find the mortar baseplate positions from where the enemy had fired these rounds. In the course of the patrols, they found 5 of these baseplates, no sign of the enemy, and there was the feeling that this was just a very small unit, heavy weapons unit of the Viet Cong that had launched a sort of shoot and scoot attack on the base. But the patrols continued to go out. Around midday, or just before, Major Harry Smith, leading his 105 Australians and 3 New Zealanders of the Forward Observer Artillery Party, headed out from the base just as a concert was getting underway with Cole Joy and Little Patty. They were starting to warm up for the concert, just as we've got the warm-ups now here. As those noises were receding behind them as they moved through the tall grass and out across that area towards the Long Tan rubber plantation, they've had their first encounter at around 3:15 with a small group of enemy. Harry Smith later said that when they found those enemy were actually using AK-47s, the penny didn't drop. To them, they didn't realise that these were actually main force regular soldiers. They continued to pursue the enemy deeper and deeper into the Long Tan rubber. As they advanced into the Long Tan rubber, suddenly the lead platoon, 11 platoon, found itself coming under very heavy fire. Little by little, the isolated platoons began to find themselves under very heavy fire from a large enemy force. They had to congregate back. 11 platoon was almost annihilated with the heavy fire from all quarters. They had to pull themselves back into a company position and, of course, then fought off these repeated assaults.
And it was chaos and carnage. We saw wave after wave after wave of the Viet Cong, and as you say, North
Indeed,
Vietnamese troops
trying to hold back human wave assaults. Fortunately, supported by accurate artillery fire from the base.
And it was very bitter. There was a monsoon at the time, but the Australians eventually prevailed at heavy cost to the Australians, but also a much heavier cost for the Vietnamese.
Indeed. I mean, the monsoon broke from the time the first rounds were fired and seemed to last exactly the length of the battle, just over 3 hours. When peace finally reigned again, the rain stopped, the artillery stopped, and the enemy dispersed and pulled back. But yes, the casualties were enormous, about 1/3 of an entire company killed or wounded. 18 men died in the conflict, or one afterwards, 24 wounded. This was a heavy loss, but the loss amongst the Viet Cong wasn't known until the following morning, when the company went back into the position, found these shredded rubber trees, the signs of carnage everywhere.
Almost indescribable scenes, according to the veterans who
Indeed,
talk about that.
245 bodies, and then the counting stopped as they stripped the bodies, searched, and then buried them all at the site of the battle. What was surprising for most of the men going back in there, along with the appalling stench, as you can imagine, in the tropics, of bodies that had been out overnight, was the scene of the carnage, the shredded trees, the white latex coming from the rubber trees, but also in one small area where 11 platoon had been almost wiped out, in an arc, still with their rifles to their shoulders, a group of these men still virtually on duty, lying dead. Many of the men thought they were still alive.
Yeah,
they'd been washed clean by the rain overnight.
We'll talk more in a moment, actually, about just why this battle has so much significance 50 years on. We'll come back to you. Thank you very much for that. But the commemorations got underway very early this morning. In fact, the beautiful pre-dawn silence here in Canberra was broken by the very moving reading out of the names of all of the 521 Australians who died in the Vietnam conflict. Let's take a look.
Warrant Officer Class 2, Brian Walsh, 27th of June, 1969, age 29.
Private Leslie James Petit, 4th of July, 1969, age 21.
Crowds later stood in silence at the War Memorial as the full impact of the Vietnam War really sunk in, and memories ran very deep and very quickly. A number of dignitaries spoke about the meaning of the war and why it continues to hold such a prominent place in the national psyche today.
It was a legendary battle where facts became legends, and the legends thrilled and inspired an army rich in battle history. I was a cadet here in Canberra in my second year at the Royal Military College, and we thirsted in the weeks and months that followed for every tiny morsel of information about this incredible action and the men, the warriors who fought it.
To remember the individual sacrifices that we made in our name and devotion to duty and to our country. And the second is that there are in the end some truths by which we live as Australians, and they're worth fighting to defend, politically, diplomatically, and at times, militarily.
The head of the Australian War Memorial, Brendan Nelson, before him the Governor-General, Sir Peter Cosgrove, at that very moving ceremony some hours ago, just up the road at the War Memorial. Now, up until very recently, the Vietnam War was the longest conflict Australia had ever been engaged in. More than, or close to rather, 60,000 Australian service personnel took place in that conflict over the 10 years that Australia was engaged on the ground in Vietnam. Initial widespread support for the war quickly changed to opposition in many quarters as the bloody impact was felt, and the impact of conscription also took hold in parts of Australia. This report from the ABC's National Defence correspondent Andrew Green.
Australia's commitment began in 1962 and its involvement in the so-called Dirty War stretched for the most part of a decade. Fearing a southward surge of communism, the Australian government dispatched military advisors to support US operations in Vietnam in the early 60s. At home, to bolster a depleted army, national service was introduced in 1963, and while new recruits came in their droves, it was a decision that would ultimately divide the nation. 2 years later, as the US unleashed the greatest air bombing campaign in history, the Australian Army's 1st Battalion departed for Vietnam. They would be the first of thousands of combat soldiers deployed over the 6 years. 1966 would see Australian troop numbers increase dramatically to over 4,000. While on the ground, Australian forces established a stronghold in Nui Dat, deep in Viet Cong territory. Just 3 months after they arrived, members of 6RAR-D Company walked out through the wire to search for Viet Cong forces. Around 4 p.m. in the rubber plantations at Long Tan, they were attacked. For 3 hours, 108 men, surrounded and outnumbered by thousands, fought for their lives, supported by other Allied forces. It wasn't until the following day that the extent of the carnage was revealed. 18 Australians were dead, another 24 wounded, and hundreds of Viet Cong killed. During the following 3 years, Australian forces would engage in many bloody operations, but the turning point came in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. Viet Cong forces raged through South Vietnam, attacking towns and cities, including an assault on the US Embassy in Saigon. It would prove to be the beginning of the end, with the US deciding it would gradually wind back its commitment. Australia would follow suit, announcing a staged withdrawal in 1970.
We're going home, we're happy!
And by the end of 1972, almost all the troops had left Vietnam and Australia's war was over. For Australia, the entire commitment saw over 500 service personnel killed and over 3,000 wounded, but thousands more are still bearing the scars.
The ABC's defence correspondent Andrew Green. Colonel Phan Tan Binh was one of the key commanders on the Vietnamese side on this day 50 years ago in the Battle of Long Tan. 50 years on, he looks back and remembers moments of cruelty, but also moments of great shared humanity. The Colonel sat down and shared his experiences with the ABC Southeast Asia correspondent Liam Cochrane.
During the battle, I was the one who went ahead first and reported the situation. The first time we met the Australians, from our point of view, their artillery was very powerful. That had a big impact on our side. At one time, the two sides were fighting almost hand to hand. We found 2 Australian soldiers, but at that stage, the Australian onslaught was really powerful. It was so violent. We thought if we keep the 2 Australians, they might not survive, so we left them at the place where the cross is now.
You must have seen great acts of bravery on your side of the fighting. Tell me about some of those acts of bravery.
There were many people who were very brave. One of our comrades was injured in the stomach. He had his intestines coming out. But he used his pants as a bandage and continued fighting.
You've visited Australia and you've met with Australians, the former enemy. How did it feel when you met with those former soldiers?
When I meet with Australian people, we're really happy. We talk to each other about the stories of war. Most Australians came just for a year. Some died, some returned alive. One guy told me he used a sniffer dog to try and find me in my little tunnel, but he didn't find me. It's funny, and we're happy when we talk about these things now in the time of peace.
When you look back on it, do you feel like it was a great waste of young lives, or do you feel like it was a sacrifice that your side needed to make for the future of Vietnam?
Well, no one wants a war, but when it happened, there was absolutely a fight, and when there's fighting, people will die. Nobody wants that. But for Vietnamese people, it's not a waste to fight and to sacrifice for the freedom of our country.
How do you think back on war? What do you think about war?
The war is over. Vietnamese are like everyone else. We want to have peace and heal the wounds of war. Nowadays, the party in the state also wants to connect properly with the region and the world. Honestly, I'm fed up with war.
Sorry. That report from our Southeast Asia correspondent Liam Cochrane. As you can probably see behind me, crowds are well and truly massing. We're expecting several thousand by the time the service gets underway in about 15 minutes' time. Somewhere in the crowd behind me is Siobhan Hinu, as she is speaking with some of the people gathering here to pay their respects. Siobhan, good morning.
Good morning, Michael. Well, with me here today is Neville Gare. He was in charge of an artillery unit, a very vital job during the Battle of Long Tan. He was back at the base at Nui Dat. Neville, can you tell me what your job was that night?
Right, I was running the Fire Support Coordination Centre, which involved virtually everything that was in the air, shells, helicopters, and we were in touch with virtually all those people. I found it fascinating because we got a big picture and you could feel the tension from these radio operators. Quite remarkable, almost as if they were next door to you. Later on that evening, when they bring in the Chinooks with the extra ammunition, I was talking to the guys out on the landing pad, two of them alone with a Land Rover. They were definitely frightened, and you could hear it.
And of course you were in charge of that very critical ammunition drop, which helped out the boys of D Company when they were encircled. It must have been terrifying in those moments as the battle wore on, and you knew how critical your influence might have been.
Well, yes, I guess so, but things go very quickly, and you don't always remember what happened. But yes, we were aware of it.
And Neville, 50 years now, half a century since that battle. What's it like to be here remembering today?
Wonderful. Makes me very humble, thinking of all the guys that died along the way. Some of the fellows I haven't seen for 50 years. My close assistant, Sergeant Dewey Spark, first time in 50 years I've seen him. Didn't recognise him, he didn't recognise me, but we had name tags on. So it's been marvellous. And a feeling of humbleness, really, when you think of the sacrifice of the young blokes in the front there. So you're proud, but you're humble.
And after today's ceremony, what's the plan? More reuniting with old friends, telling some worries?
Well, yes, that's going to go on. I'm afraid war is a terrible thing. Once you get going, somebody else butts in and says, "Oh, but you remember this and you remember that." And but in fact, I've got a long trip back to Newcastle, so we won't be celebrating too much, I don't think.
Keeping it under wraps. All right. Neville Gare, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Siobhan Hugh asking the questions there. Thank you very much, Siobhan. Now, the protest movement against the Vietnam War, was unlike any other protest movement Australia had seen. Initially, as was the case with previous conflicts, there was widespread public support for the government sending men and women into harm's way. But as that decade dragged on, the impact of the war was felt, and importantly, thousands of young men were conscripted. That national mood shifted, and it shifted rather dramatically. Rebecca Armitage reports.
Stem from one incident, the President Johnson visit.
It began with just a handful of students and trade unionists. But after nearly a decade of fighting and with no victory in sight, Australia's opposition to the Vietnam War became a national movement. In 1970, hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom had never protested before, marched through the country's capital cities with a message for the government.
1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 4.
Among them was Rowan Cahill. He joined the anti-war movement and became one of its key leaders when he was called up to serve in 1965.
I was just a voteless young person that saw something wrong with this.
The university student and his brother threw his conscription papers in an incinerator.
Well, we just burned it, and then I wrote to the government and said, "Hey, I've destroyed my national service papers." And then you think to yourself, "Oh, geez, I've broken the law here."
Some historians claim the government was ready to withdraw Australian troops when the moratorium marches began. But Rowan Cahill says the protesters' contribution should not be underestimated.
The anti-war activism had actually gone a long way towards crippling and undermining the process of conscription.
Ken Foster served 21 years in the Australian Army, including a tour of duty in Vietnam in the late 60s. He says the very soldiers the protesters fought to bring home faced a cold reception when they returned to Australia.
The national servicemen who came home, virtually got off the plane, were told to get changed into civvies and don't tell anyone where you've been or what you've been doing.
Tensions ran so high that some veterans were physically and verbally abused by protesters.
To target the actual servicemen who didn't have any say one way or the other whether they were going to be there or not was certainly disappointing.
For those who fought in Vietnam and those who fought against the war, the memories of one of Australia's most divisive periods will never fade. Rebecca Armitage, ABC News.
Rebecca Armitage reporting there. Now, those soldiers who survived the Vietnam War faced often bigger and more personal struggles once they got back, as is often the case after wars. Post-traumatic stress disorder has wreaked a lot of havoc in the Vietnam veteran community. One group that has done fantastic work in trying to help vets is the Soldier On organisation. I'm joined now by its co-founder, John Vale, himself a fourth-generation soldier. John, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
50 years on, particularly focusing on Long Tan this morning, but talking about the Vietnam War generally, how devastating a problem was post-traumatic stress disorder for the Vietnam vets?
I think it was absolutely incredible, and I think one of the biggest reasons for that was because of the community response when Vietnam veterans came home, that we as a community did not support them the way we could and should have, but fantastic to see now that the community is genuinely supporting the veteran. It doesn't matter the politics of the war, we support the veteran. But we've got a lot of lessons to learn to make sure that we support veterans early now and get intervention in there early. And so the stigma as well, which existed a lot in the Vietnam days, doesn't. And I think that's a general issue with mental health in Australia, but specifically for veterans coming back with PTSD.
Sadly though, and as you say, it took a long time for the Australian community to really warmly embrace the Vietnam veteran community. Sadly, was the damage done though for lots of vets before that happened?
Look, I think it was for many, and unfortunately they've become socially isolated. They don't actually and haven't continued to be part of the commemoration today and other commemorations. And I think this is about today and all the commemorations that will come forward over the following battles that occurred in Vietnam, an opportunity for us to thank those veterans who have done so much for us and recognise the scars that they've held for so long, and to make sure we just don't do that with this generation of veterans that are coming back.
You're talking about lessons. What lessons, what do we know now that we didn't know in the early 70s when the Vietnam vets were coming home to help those who fought, and not just fought battles, but suffered various psychological injuries along the way?
Well, firstly, we didn't know PTSD existed then because it didn't become a diagnosis until the 1980s. So we were, I guess, at a point where the science wasn't really keeping up with what veterans were seeing in their families and the community. And thank goodness that is changing. We've still got a ways to go, working on neuroscience and elements like that. I'm not best placed. A lot of other people far more eminent than myself, but we are starting to recognise that these things are not something that causes, it's not from weakness or anything like that. It's about the neuroscience and about the condition that veterans go into that no Australian in many instances should. So as a community, it's about early engagement, reducing the stigma and providing support services, not just when they come back, but for the rest of their lives.
And sadly, we saw stories as recently as the weekend in the News Corp papers about the distressingly large number of suicides by Army veterans, service personnel veterans generally. How do we stop that though? It's such a big problem, such an ongoing problem.
Look, for us, we think it's a three-phased area around transition, especially when you get out of the Defence Force. You go through a particular area inside Defence that is different to society, and you come out and society is somewhat different. Making sure that transition is done well, making sure especially those that are coming out with physical and mental health issues are supported into employment and transition properly, and then give that support for them and their families for the rest of their life. Providing mental health support so they can continue to get that, reducing stigma, as well as providing social inclusion programs. These veterans need to be able to do what they're doing today regularly and get together, because that is very cathartic.
John Bale, thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on the fantastic work Soldier On does.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Pleasure.
John Bale there. Now, some of the most iconic, if indeed searing images from military history came from the Vietnam War. International film crews, including Australian crews, were granted unprecedented access to the battlegrounds in Vietnam, and as a result, images, often very graphic images, were transmitted right into lounge rooms right across the country. It was indeed the first television war.
The strategy was to say, look, anybody can come in and just see what great things we're doing, you know, for the Vietnamese people and attacking the communists.
I saw a napalm attack on a series of villages in the Delta, and I went in in the aftermath of that, and the evidence, the evidence of human suffering was shocking, and a big why crept into my head. Why is this happening?
One of the most potent sequences, I think, that I'd shot on the Vietnam War was a little girl who was being brought into this hospital on the outskirts of Saigon, and she had a leg missing that was blown off when she was 3. She was now 7. Her parents had been killed in the war, and she was going to be fitted with an artificial leg made out of bits of wood and bits of tin, very, very crude. And it really hit me of what has she done? One little girl, an example of thousands of little girls who had lost limbs in that war.
The American military have suggested that it was this graphic, relentless, uncensored reporting that lost their war is absolute nonsense.
As far as the Vietnamese was concerned, this was just another foreign colonial invasion which they were eventually going to win.
American morale collapsed, I would think, well and truly by the late 60s.
I don't know why I'm shooting these people.
I remember in one of my early visits to a lot of the bureaus in Saigon, particularly the American bureaus, the bureau chiefs would tell you about stories they'd filed that were never published.
That was certainly true, sadly, with the ABC, who were at that stage. The news executives were mostly old newspaper men, a lot of Catholics, and they saw the war as a holy crusade.
A number of stories did come out, and I think the audience really understood that this was an atrocious war.
Since the Vietnam War, they've tightened, the Americans and we have tightened up about what press people, journalists can do.
You can be embedded, but of course you're totally the creature of the army and the unit you're with, and you virtually have to report what they're doing in a positive manner.
Yes, a lot of those images collectively seared onto our brain so many decades down the track. The National Service commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan and Vietnam Veterans Day is about to begin. The final dignitaries are arriving behind me. Let's bring back in Ashley Eakins from the Australian War Memorial. Ashley, welcome back. Why do you think this particular battle holds such a strong position in the Australian psyche 50 years on?
It was the first really major clash that Australians had with the enemy. It was the single most costly battle. There were bigger battles, there were longer, more protracted battles with much larger casualties over time. And possibly there were, it wasn't typical of the experience of every single veteran as they would remember their time. I think most veterans remembered the period of their tour as one of endless patrolling, dangers of mines, bunker clashes, small, sharp, very fierce clashes that could sometimes turn into protracted engagements for hours, but mostly it was that they had embedded in their memory. But I think it was the first impact of this battle in the public consciousness, with the reports back home of 18 dead, 24 wounded, huge enemy casualty. I think that is what embedded itself and resonated, and still does to this day, with the veterans.
Conversely, the public consciousness might have been swayed the other way if indeed the Australians lost there and we suffered catastrophic losses. That's not talking down the 18 soldiers who died on the day, but we had a company there of 105 men, 3 New Zealanders. It could have quickly gone the other way if we'd lost that battle.
Indeed, I mean, at the height of the battle, there was a fear that we might lose the entire company. And that, of course, was on the minds of the battalion commander and the task force commander, I'm sure. It could have certainly changed the whole dynamic of Australian involvement in this Cold War conflict. As it is, it was celebrated as a victory despite the cost.
We are just showing pictures of the dignitaries arriving, including within the last few moments the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, the Governor-General Peter Cosgrove, the Opposition Leader Bill Shorten, US Ambassador John Berry amongst the dignitaries gathering here for this very special day. Ashley, we also saw a somewhat belated recognition of the gallantry of those soldiers in the last week or so. Was that a bit overdue?
Some would say very much overdue. Certainly Harry Smith, the commander of D Company, had been fighting for this for many, many years. At the time, there were 16 Imperial Awards given to all the soldiers involved. That, even on that scale of 16 awards, was seen to be fairly meagre.
In fact, we are, as we're seeing at the Governor-General, Sir Peter Cosgrove arrive, there was a very strong push for one of the members of the Australian team to be granted a Victoria Cross. There's a military flyover. You're the expert, Ashley. What's that?
C-130.
C-130 Hercules flying over. Yep. A ceremonial flyover before the service gets underway.
To be followed by more, I believe.
Yes, including possibly a B-52.
Apparently so, yeah.
A very strong push for, Jack Kirby, was it?
Big Jack Kirby was without a doubt, he was awarded the DCM, he was without a doubt the outstanding character in the memories of all the men. The Company Sergeant Major, who was renowned amongst all the soldiers, Nashos and regulars alike, for being almost a father figure, heroic on the day of the battle, moving amongst the men, distributing the ammunition, encouraging men, knowing that some of these were young national servicemen who'd never had a clash before, never experienced a contact, encouraging them to hold their ground and to steady their aim.
Often joking with them at times
even joking at the height of the battle, you know. And remembered afterwards as the great mainstay of the besieged company during the battle. Tragically, 6 months later, killed by a misdirected artillery round when this landed on the company position. 3 men killed, 18 wounded, amongst them Big Jack Kirby. Most of the men couldn't believe it. This man, who was twice the age of most of these young soldiers, who were an average age of around 22, Jack, in his 40s, experienced, rugged, tough type. Really, the shock of him going in that way was too much for many of the men.
Ashley Eakins for the War Memorial, thank you very much for your insights this morning. Thanks for joining us.